Alrighty, welcome to our discussion this week on A Natural History of Rape by Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer. This is a textbook that followed on from our discussion last week about the rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. And next week we will be discussing The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker, and the week after that, The Adapting Mind. So all of this month, as well as last week, was about trying to understand rape, because we read this book about rape in Nanking, about the more or less a genocide that the Japanese perpetuated in the Chinese city of Nanking. And there was horrific acts committed in that book. So we're trying to just kind of find out what made those acts so easily accessible to those men. Because what was unique there is they generally raped, which was unexpected because the Japanese code of ethic kind of didn't explicitly promote that. Like the General Mitsui was ashamed by the men's behavior, which then begged to say that the men engaged in that despite, like it was a surprise that the men engaged in those rapes. And yet, when you read a book like A Natural History of Rape, it isn't any surprise at all why those rapes would happen, because this book offers, it looks into the issue of rape from a evolutionary perspective, to say what biological mechanisms have developed over the many years to then exploit, to then be exploited by certain environmental cues to then become activated in causing horrific outcomes. And then why, what is the effects and the repercussions and of that, and whether or not they're adaptive or maladaptive. So I'm joined here today by Nata as well as John. And let me, you guys can say a little intro and then I'll dive into why I found the book meaningful. But actually, sorry, first, we do these meetings every single week. A little bit about Bevry. We do these meetings every week, been doing them for several years now, 2 to 3 now, and they're just to develop our personal wisdom, prove ourselves wrong, get better at things, and become smarter and more useful people. So you can find all the details and link in the description, and we're here to learn. If we say anything incorrect, we're here to be corrected and to learn. We're just trying our best to figure out life and figure out the rules of life. Alrighty, John's unmuted. Sorry, I'll let John go first because he's eager to go.
Yeah, thanks.
Your intro.
Thanks, Ben. And just as a reminder, we are very much evolving in our knowledge on all of these types of topics. And so like what we knew a year or so ago has been updated by what we know now. And so what we talk about now is definitely going to be updated from what we know into the future from now as well.
If we've said something objectionable and it gets clipped, ask us whether we still believe that in a year.
By then, we'll already be thrown off of all platforms. Don't worry about it. Also, should forewarn you all, Ben is running off of very little sleep, so he may be somewhat incoherent, but we'll try to translate him as we go through it. So. So okay, this book definitely was the Natural History of Rape is definitely a useful book in getting a better understanding for why rape can occur and does occur, and especially like in reading it of the context of having just read Rape of Nanking. This gives a much better understanding for why, under no reasonable circumstances, men do rape when they are given a chance. So that was one of the things we talked about in Rape of Nanking, how just like from our own current perspective, it like where we are in our society and our culture is like even the thought of what the Japanese soldiers did in that situation is just so incomprehensible and like something that is so far from our own understanding of how we do anything that it's very hard to understand why this type of thing occurs. And I think this book is very helpful for that.
And also, specifically, it's more that all of our intuitions proved insufficient for explaining it, right? That's the important bit. Like you would think, oh, you could just explain it as blah, but no, like it just kind of left us a bit dumbfounded as to what could actually be sufficient explanations for this behavior.
Yeah, yeah. Having the idea that it is, like we have the idea that our moral intuitions are like pre-built into us, and we know automatically what's right from wrong. And so for anybody to go against what we consider our moral intuitions we see that as an indication of they were raised within a culture that has taught them like wrong intuitions to work off of. And that certainly is the case for many situations. Like there are incentive structures that are put into place that reward the wrong types of, or reward behaviors that end up having negative consequences in the future. And I think like this book points out how evolution itself runs off of that same sort of mechanism to a point. Like there's the antlers of some caribou or some species of deer of some type that through sexual selection, their antlers just grew larger and larger and larger to the point that it inhibited their survival ability. So anyway, just to I guess lay it out there, pointing out how the mechanisms of evolution by natural selection are not always going to be, or maybe not always going to be, aligned with how we wish the world to become. So by understanding that, it gives us a much better process of dealing with those situations where our biological drives and our cultural norms and our moral obligations, things like that, where those two are in disagreement, we need to understand that so that we can correct that. Like if I know that I'm addicted to cocaine or something like that, I have to put myself into a situation where I'm not going to be in the presence of cocaine, or else I'll just fall right off the bandwagon again. So if it is the case that the mechanisms of evolution have built into us these types of behaviors, then that provides us with invaluable information so as to keep us from falling victim to our own biology. So,
right. Yeah, it's actually, to jump onto that point, they start off the book with a quote, "As scientists, we value knowledge and assume that trying to understand everything about why rape occurs is far more beneficial for women in the long term, even if the scientific inquiry inspires anxiety and revulsion." Alrighty, Nata, do your intro, and welcome, Tyler.
Yeah, I read this book a few years ago, and now I reread the first 4 chapters, and I think I remember a bit from the other chapters as well. And yeah, I really liked the book when I read it the first time. And I think my motivation is to understand rape, why it occurs, and also like what I can do to avoid it happening to me, and like to reduce it in society as well. So yeah, and I think that this book can actually help with that. So, yeah.
Right. Cool. Tyler, do you want to do any preface before we jump in with the book discussion?
No preface. I'd really just like to be a student today and learn as much as I can.
All right, the safest choice. Good idea. Alrighty, so let's kick it off with the structure of the book and to kind of go over. So I'm going to share my screen with the table of contents to kind of give people an overview of how the book's done. All right, so we have it. So okay, so we got preface. So it starts off with the rape and evolutionary theory. This was an incredibly painful chapter because it's, I don't know, I put it in the private chat to our group when I was reading it. It's like two men mansplaining evolution to everybody. And there was a lot of things that I felt was very objectionable in that, but the more I ended up reading through, like, yeah, it was quite hard because there was about a third of the book, the middle third of the book is focused on the actual arguments, the proposition of rape as a evolutionary exploitation of sexual selection. Whereas the first third is all about why this is important and how such a perspective is being neglected in the social sciences. And then the last third then went into specifically what can be done with this information. And again, that was focused on the criticisms against such an idea. But also in terms of how this information is actually being used by policymakers as well as just individuals and therapists and whatnot to actually effectively, that's the key word, they effectively treat and prevent rape. Whereas they outline that postmodern or specifically blank slate sociological explanations for rape are not particularly effective in preventing rape, and they're not particularly effective in treating the psychological trauma of rape. So the first chapter kind of was an overview of evolution. So it's quite interesting. So I've read The Selfish Gene before by Richard Dawkins, and that was my first kind of introduction to evolutionary sociology. And where these authors seem to completely reject memes, they completely reject group selection. They only entertain individual selection. And they cite quite extensively in the first third and last third why they view that group selection isn't adequately, can be explained by individual selection. That I'm not particularly sure, but that's also why we're reading The Blank Slate by Pinker and The Adaptive Mind the week after, because we're reading the three best sociological works trying to explain such phenomena to get the different understandings and compare it, because maybe these authors are insufficient because they haven't taken into account group selection. That said, what they raise about individual selective traits or individual evolutionary traits would still matter, because they still observe these things, they are still predictive. Therefore, a group selection trait would only be an addition to their explanation. Alrighty, let's jump in back to the table of contents. So the evolution of sex differences, this is where the book really got good. And why do men rape? That was quite good as well. Pain and anguish of rape, which talked about the psychological trauma. Why have social scientists failed to Darwinize? The social science explanation of rape, law and punishment, social influences of male sexuality, education programs, barriers, treatment, and recovery, as well as conclusion. Now, for each section, they've split it up into one big chapter and then kind of divided each thing on the little stacking arguments, which was quite actually helpful in dealing with the book, because otherwise you'll be like, oh my gosh, when is this going to end? And it's just like, oh, okay, they summarize this point quite quickly, and then you can move on to the next thing, which may be a lot more interesting.
We should try to go into the core argument from the book of like what the entire book's like central premise is, and then maybe also go into why the social scientists and the many people such as feminists and academics have been so anti-receptive of such a theory that they put forward.
Yeah, so that's
the Wikipedia list for those who had reviewed it positively and those who'd reviewed it negatively.
I shared the Wikipedia page
names at the front, and then the rest of the paragraph is all negative, like individually listed with links for each.
Yeah, they got a lot of slack for this book. However, they didn't really get any. I tried to read things that cited this research paper. There's 61 citations on ResearchGate, and none of them seemed to acknowledge their arguments. They just dismissed them, and that was quite infuriating. So that's the structure of the book. It's divided in that. So a third to explaining evolution to kind of keep people up to date, because a lot of people really have no idea about it, and including myself, I didn't realize the extent of my lack of knowledge in that area. And then with that new foundations, then they lay out the arguments, which are way more digestible if you're familiar with evolutionary theory. Then after that, then they go into the repercussions in society for the alternative approaches, a blank slate approach versus a evolutionary approach. So the main proposition, the theory amounts to evolution is at its core sexual selection, because that is how evolution evolves, through sexual selection. Because if something doesn't reproduce, then it's out of the gene pool. It hasn't evolved. So sexual selection is what determines what genes or what traits then progress to the next line. And you could then say, well, what about people who die in silly ways or whatever? Fine, but they don't get to have sexual selection because they're dead. So it still comes down to who gets access to reproduction. In that case, then they say male and females have evolved differently based on their biological traits, which is for a man, they can produce sperm nearly infinitely, whereas and impregnate 100 women in about an hour, I guess. If they're Superman, or maybe a porn star, maybe a week, that would be better, right? Whereas for a woman, they can only be impregnated once every 9 months, more or less. And
longer.
Yeah, the recovery times and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But it depends whether or not I don't know, maybe one could.
Anyway, yeah.
Anyway,
the sexual difference
is often delayed by lactation. This is often the case.
But yeah,
right.
the sexual differences between the male and female means that there are different strategies they must take in how they act within the world, so as to be most genetically fit, I guess, or evolutionarily fit.
Right. So this long investment that women have, because it's a long investment, a significant investment, then it requires significant selection. Whereas for a male, then they're not going to have that high selection in certain cases. So this is where they spend a significant part in that first chapter arguing about what proximate cause is and ultimate cause. So an ultimate cause is the thing that is going to be true regardless of situation, whereas proximate cause is a strategy or an adaptation specific to a specific environmental cue. So, for instance, rape is not committed by every single male, despite despite men and some women. And the book only focuses really on male to female rape, and it defines rape as physical coercion for sexual acts, I guess. And in which case, yeah, I think that would be adequate.
Yeah, which goes against
Well,
kind of the
coercion for the result of, I think they wanted to argue vaginal intercourse, but often in some cases other as well.
Yeah, so they break that into
with the
subcategories.
struggle, right? This is the actual part that matters. With the struggle from the female being as strong as they possibly can up to preventing death from their own life or something, or serious harm.
Wait, say that. What do you mean by that last part?
So, in other words, if the struggle would have
Oh.
led to death, then they, I guess, refrain from struggling.
That's not within. So that's a side effect. So they would still put, okay, the definition of rape that they would use would still be physical coercion for a sexual act. Then they break that down in subcategories: penile, anal, fellatio, whatever, and then from there, then they talk about. They had a chapter about law and order, more or less, and they talked about the legal repercussions. So one of those legal repercussions was also related to female fighting. So they specifically said that the effort required by women in restraint will also be a proximate adaptation. So a woman would fight off the person generally if it is more advantageous for her to fight off the rapist. However, there is many cases facilitating that physical coercion where it is not advantageous for a female to resist. And different females also seem to have different strategies for resisting. So some would probably shut down and others will resist more.
Also, that there's like how much a woman resists can lead to the trauma that they have afterwards. Whereas if they feel that, like, after the fact, they felt that they hadn't resisted enough, then there's this kind of social feeling that it becomes more traumatic for them. Yes, that there's that guilt that they have, especially if they're in a relationship with someone else, that there's, I guess, sort of this empathetic feeling toward, or in the book, they explain it as in order to protect the investment with their male counterpart, that if they hadn't struggled enough, then the man might leave, and then they're left in a desperate situation, especially if you're prior to birth control and things like that, where you're knocked up and you need some sort of protection, be it through your family or through your mate or however you can. And so by not showing those signs of struggles to people to prove that they were raped rather than say sexually persuaded through non-coercive means, then that the mate will realize that this woman might go about tricking me and turning me into somebody that's putting resources into a person that is not a genetic relation, that is of no genetic relation to myself, being having been cuckolded, essentially. And so that is like kind of, there's a lot of explanations for all the different parts that make up this.
Yeah. Even for that, they also talk into the adaptive strategy there. So that being married women will be of reproductive. Yeah, I think it was married. So they said what was interesting, it was female defense mechanisms are also adaptive. And that women who reach menarche, so reproductive age, the more reproductive value the woman has, the more likely she is to be traumatized, and the more likely she is to fight, because the investment that is being taken for her, that violation of her choice of where to invest her pregnancy, her reproductive value has been taken. Therefore, she's more willing to fight to protect that. Whereas they include rape for children, as well as rape in post-reproductive females. And they find that, yeah, children don't particularly fight back when they are raped. And that seems to be, and then they looked specifically into the age data. And also children generally have less psychological trauma from rape, which was surprising. But again, they probably don't have the conceptual understanding at that point about the cost. There would be different type of psychological trauma. It would probably be more a trauma from grooming rather than rape or whatnot.
I should also add, like, one of the responses that I read to that study.
John, you get let Natha talk.
Sorry,
we're too eager.
Yeah,
John.
I was just going to say. Yeah. I was just going to say that children, they defined like children here as 1 to 11 years old before they
have reached puberty.
Right.
Yeah, and okay, maybe go into, let's see, the core argument, because I don't know, you were explaining the core argument.
John,
but
you're eager to talk about something I'm obviously not talking about. So
okay,
so
sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Right.
Finish your thought.
Yeah. Okay. So they discuss things as so they break it down. So there's ultimate cause and then proximate cause, and then adaptions arise from that. And so those adaptions, you could think of it in terms of like say junk food as an instance, right? So we have the ultimate cause to be healthy and fit, right? And that will take preference to certain food. However, then that is adapted in different ways based on environmental cues. So then they talk about how there's side effects of byproducts. So what is rape actually a byproduct of something general? So a general adaptation, and they generally reject all general adaptations. That was my interpretation. They're just like general adaptations don't particularly exist because they were always proximate adaptations for something previous. There's only byproducts of a proximate adaptation, which is then being misapplied in other areas, or there is so the stance pretty much is every adaptation had a proximate cause at the time it evolved. Then after that, there's a beneficial side products from it, and then there's not beneficial side products. So for instance, eyesight evolved for specific things that gave us evolutionary advantage at the time it evolved, but now we use it for all sorts of weird things. Including maladaptive stuff, like probably staring into the sun would probably be something we shouldn't do, right? So there's different things. So they did quite a distinction there, because essentially what one needs to do is find what is the specific domain which a behavior is beneficial or not beneficial, and then is that behavior then controlled enough in that environment where that environment would be enough justification for it, or is there a more compelling explanation for that behavior somewhere else? And if there's a more compelling explanation, then perhaps that behavior evolved for that different proximate cause, and then its usage in this proximity in this domain was a byproduct of that earlier adaptation. So it's a bit hard to go into that without pulling up specific examples. But I don't want to. Yeah.
From my understanding of the evolutionary terms proximate and ultimate cause, like it to give a very low resolution definition of those things, it seems like a proximate cause would be the how, like the mechanism, like be in that like specific moment in time, what caused this thing to happen. So like the proximate cause of my arm going like this is my tendons and my neural structure allowing for that to happen. And then an ultimate cause would be like it as a low resolution definition, the why. So like why did I move my hand at this moment in time? Or for something as minuscule as that, it would be irrelevant. But like why does like the image of a naked woman cause bodily changes? Like that could have an ultimate cause explanation behind it through evolutionary through an evolutionary explanation for something like that.
Yeah, energy is exchanged through moving parts. It's a chain, it's a sequence of momentum. And you have a first initiating, that's your ultimate, essentially, you could call it, the thing that started it all. You can also conceptualize that in your arm example as the sum total of all that caused your arm to move is
kind of like the like from Aristotelian physics, the teleological reason for why a thing occurs is the purpose for why it happened. And so like evolution builds in certain purposes under assumptions from past environments.
Yeah.
And so
well, it's interesting because the initial causative agent is tied in a loop to the proximal causation by that teleological aim. That's what's so cool about that. Like you have an initiating event that causes the arm to move, let's say grasping the cup, right? But it is because, and that's the teleological response, that you wanted the cup, right? So the cup is out here, the initiation is here, and then a chain of events is initiated to satisfy that initiation. So that is what's so mysterious about trying to understand an extraordinarily complicated system through time, like evolution, like various overlapping adaptations. Because the initial sexual selection of a various trait in an animal ultimately was done by that sexual reproduction process, right? And so if you state that the given form or traits of the individual that was chosen for sexual selection represents the ultimate cause, right? The initial mutation that was beneficial enough to increase sexual reproduction, then anything that occurs after that, wherever you analyze it, can be viewed as a proximal cause.
Right. Yeah. So that kind of ties in. So I think for them, the ultimate cause is always really what enhances sexual selection. That seemed to be, because everything else they kind of outlined was just proximal cause. So I've got here.
If we could bring in the criticism to that, do you want to do that?
Yeah, well, let me just read this bit out. So they've got here, the challenge in applying an ultimate or evolutionary analysis is not to determine whether an adaptation is a product of selection. It is determined the nature of the selective pressure that is responsible for the trait. The selective pressure will be apparent in the functional design of the adaptation. Not all aspects of living organisms are adaptations. Indeed, Williams in 1966 emphasized that adaptation is a special and onerous concept that should be used only where it is really necessary. And the evolutionists that Williams inspired have been well aware that a trait's mere existence does not mean that it was directly favored by natural selection, nor is the demonstration that a trait or a character increases an individual's reproductive success sufficient evidence that the trait is an adaptation. So they give the example of blood being red, and it's quite interesting because only a few weeks ago I was discussing with my partner. I'm like, I wonder what the evolutionary cause of blood being red is. Like, why does it reflecting red light have something? Like, is our blood photogenic in a way that discriminates against red light? But then they actually answer this. So they say, in addition to snow packing by fox feet, another example of a byproduct is the red color of human arterial blood. This trait did not arise because of selection in the context of blood color variance among individuals. That is, redness of arterial blood did not cause individuals with arterial blood of that color to become more frequent in succeeding generations. Instead, selection acting in other contexts gave rise to the trait of the epiphenomenon of adaptions. Human arterial blood is red for two proximate reasons: the chemistry of oxygen and hemoglobin in blood, and human color vision. Hence, the ultimate causation of the color of blood lies in the selective pressures that produce the chemical composition of human blood and human color vision. So, okay, that follow-on example is actually a good one. So another example of a byproduct is a higher death rate of males relative to females among humans of all ages. The higher male morality is not an adaptation. It is an incidental effect of sex-specific adaptations. Because if you think about it, if it was an adaptation, then it would be advantageous for men to kill themselves. Whereas, because that would be the thing that should be optimized for. Whereas because it's a proximate adaptation, like it's a result, a byproduct from a proximate adaptation, then it's your focus or your concern should be to, again, those stresses that cause the selective pressure that causes that trait and that byproduct.
Yeah, okay. So the core argument, I think, from Thornhill and Palmer's book is that rape itself, in our evolutionary history, has acted as a adaptive trait because it fulfilled the genetic requirement of a person giving birth. And so this is let's say a strategy that was put into play by those in our history. And this strategy has, in that history, proven effective at genetically reiterating that strategy again. So, yeah, go ahead, Natha.
Are you saying that this is a claim of the book, or
I think so. Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because they are evaluating two different theories, right? One that is a byproduct and one that is an adaptation. And I think Thornhill is the one who believes that it is an adaptation, and Palmer thinks it's
right. There's that kind of disagreement between the two. But yes, okay. Though there is still the understanding that whether it is an adaptation or a byproduct, it is still something that has been it has been bred into. Gosh, I don't.
I think this is being so difficult for you because you're wrestling with the wrong focus here. Because one of the things that was hard for me to grasp with that first thing, and I only really grasped it at the end, was that the focus really needed to be on the domain and the selective pressures. So what is the domain? You need to focus on domains rather than specific traits. So you can look at a trait, and then you have to figure out what is the domain that caused that trait to arise. So that trait could then be explained as a byproduct or a adaptation. Because if you just looked at the trait and you just looked at the context of that trait, then you may be looking in a more shallower context than was actually required. So you could say, okay, I'm not going to give an example because it's not my area of expertise, but that would be the idea, because, and that was like the same thing with the blood thing. Like if we take the idea that go Tyler.
All right. So let's say you have rabbits in a field. Okay.
Right.
You got 20 rabbits, male rabbits hanging out in the field. And the lady rabbits are off at the edge of the forest, and they're looking into the field, and they're selecting the rabbits by how cool they look. All right. Well, it just so happens that one of them evolves to become red, and that is the coolest thing that a rabbit has ever seen. So suddenly that rabbit is like king, right? Sexual reproductive king. Unfortunately, it also makes it much more easily seen by hawks or eagles or owls or whatever, right? And so the reproductive success of the animal is counterbalanced by the negative byproduct, right? Which is you're suddenly much more noticeable to the predators. This is analogous to the kind of argument that is being waged, and this is why you see such a positive, negative, critical ratio imbalance to something like a woman going to a bar wearing a mini skirt increases her likelihood of sexual reproductive strategy. Wearing the skirt is like becoming red, right? It increases your likelihood of sexual reproduction. It also, as a byproduct, increases the likelihood that someone who is capable of rape will rape you. Something like that, right? That's the general analogy.
Yeah, and then the selective pressure, so the adaptation there in the females is to increase the reproductive value of, to increase the sexual desirability of herself. So it's the rape is the byproduct of that adaptation there. So I should say not rape, but her. So wearing the red miniskirt. The byproduct of the male of an increased chance of rape inflicted on her would be the byproduct, because we have the same opposite on the domain of the male perspective, whereas rape, you wouldn't say from the male perspective that women wearing a miniskirt caused rape to be a byproduct from the male's perspective, whereas for the male's perspective, rape would be a activation of a adaptive strategy, because no one,
that is the
no
question.
one's nodding.
That is the argument. Is it actually an adaptive strategy?
Yeah.
Is it an actual adaptive strategy, or is it just a byproduct?
Yeah. So this is going. So I realized I also didn't say why. Like I let everyone else explain why they found this book really interesting. So but I didn't do it for myself. So this is where I'll tie it in. So we had, you know, I don't know, in the tech industry, there's a lot of knowledge and resources and activism for, I don't know, denouncing masculinity and toxic masculinity and whatnot. So, we're told a lot about the certain issues, and as well, like going to university and coming out of university and now being quite old and having, many, the older you get, I think the more wiser you are to an issue like rape, whereas when you're young, you're way more naive to the issue. Especially there's more alcohol when you're young, which doesn't help. So the older you get, you're like, okay, I now have good environmental and psychological strategies in place to prevent myself from being a rapist, as well as to prevent others from inflicting rape. But then you read a book like this, and then you're like, well, no, what I thought I had was completely insufficient for that purpose, which is to say that if I was placed in, they just give an overwhelming amount of data to suggest that so much about sexual selection causes behaviors and traits that are very largely persuadable over more modern circuitry, you could say. So for instance, as an example, and I'm not saying like that was quite crass, but I'll give an example to kind of clarify what I mean. So I think everyone in the life they've said, I'm never going to eat junk food again. And then maybe even the next day or a year later, you end up eating junk food again. And for men, specifically, they'll say, I'm never going to watch porn again, right? And somehow it ends up, coming back. And it's just like, so despite all the psychological efforts on your part, you know, if you then thought, oh, like, like it's kind of like a what do you call it? Like trying to climb up a hill when you don't understand the actual nature of a hill, and you're just trying to get better the entire way, when there could be like a door or a tunnel in the hill somewhere, right? And that tunnel is just kind of like align with your biological nature, or understand your biological nature, and then that way you can defend yourself. Because you know, it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of wearing like ice skates versus, yeah, wearing shoes on ice. So kind of reading this, I was just like, wow, no wonder, not in the case of rape, obviously, but like, no wonder for situations like porn or whatever, then I've been fairly ineffective, well, more effective than most people, but ineffective at completely eliminating its use over years. So through this, and just with the overwhelming data, then it's just like, wait, if like they talked about, for instance, married men, and they talked, for instance, about, you know, the different age groups and all sorts of things, as well as, you know, precarious situations. So, you know, if you were in an alcohol-induced situation with, you know, attractive, fertile, reproductive women who were also intoxicated, plus, you know, resentment over many years or whatever. These are all like little ingredients, right? Adding to an environment that are going to be triggering cues of a sexual selection strategy. That sexual selection strategy in men is going to be either consensual or not consensual. And the different environmental cues will, throughout one's life, will activate more and more different behaviors down those different paths. So, you know, you could have all the psychological defenses, right, against that. But if those cues activate, then your psychological defenses may be adequate in certain situations, but then that unexpected dragon pops its head, and, you know, suddenly, you know, your pants down or at your feet. And this explains why, like for the rape of Nanking, why General Mitsui, despite condemning rape of his army, the army engaged in rape to the shock and horror of him. However, he commanded the army from Japan, not on the ground, right? So why was it so surprising that the troops on the ground engaged in rape, right? And the book offers to say that in the environmental cues of genocide, then the cost of rape reduces to naught. And therefore, the only thing there is going to have to be, I don't know, some type of miracle to avoid it. So that is also why societies in every single culture have adopted law and order to try and prevent rape. However, because they realize this is something that emerges from this sexual selection adaptation, which can either be consensual if facilitated correctly, or non-consensual when activated. So you see, for instance, this in porn, which is the exploitation of the same circuitry. So, you know, you have this sexual selection circuitry inside a man, and porn. So, yeah, so actually, I think that's good enough for covering that evolutionary side, doing the proximate and ultimate. So now we can go into the bits about its core, the really meaty bits, which I really liked. So the one that we can probably go over all of the specific instances just because they're just so like, but the one that really stuck out to me is, for instance, you know, men have a turnover of sperm. If we don't ejaculate in like 2 weeks or a month, then we'll probably have a wet dream because we have to turn over that sperm. And you'd be like, oh, well, why does that exist? I don't know. And then they give an explanation for it. And I'll be like, well, it's evolved as a byproduct of as a byproduct, whatever. It's evolved because previously there was more, it's advantageous. So, okay, why don't men just have sperm that is like eggs? They have 100 of them and they shoot out one, right? Well, the thing is that the selective pressures, if that were the case, would have eliminated us. So the reason why men, turn over sperm every day is because selective pressures have incentivized that behavior. And so, for instance, what they found was male ejaculate size will increase when dealing with strangers, as well as dealing with a partner which they haven't seen for a while. So if they cannot be certain on the
like the sexual history of the person that they're interacting with,
yeah, within like the past 7 days or whatever, then they're going to have a larger ejaculate size, because the larger ejaculate size then offers better sperm competition with other mates' ejaculate. And males are then driven by, like, there's the thing called the Coolidge effect, which is in rats, I think it was observed, but then this also explains with great confidence why men are addicted to porn over women, is that, so in rats, the Coolidge effect is named after someone who had a ton of affairs, like crazily. So the idea is that, a male could tire having sex with one individual, but then one female, but then another female suddenly appears all hot and heavy, like in heat, ready for that male. Then that male will somehow have a new burst of energy and then be able to mate with that female. And this will continue in rats apparently until the male dies of exhaustion, so that's quite interesting.
death by snooze.
so
Hey,
it's
I couldn't stay long. I've got to take off in just a minute. But
okay.
just want to say something kind of related to that,
Yeah.
and just in general on the topic of rape, and then I'll run away.
Okay.
So the studies that you're referencing there, all of these biological studies that we do are looking at populations of behaviors, right? It's never individuals. And if you keep that in mind, and to bring in this other piece, which is that discussing the concept of rape is in the realm of morality for us, right? It's the realm of consent and non-consent. It's the realm of taking choice away from other people. And so we discuss it as an is or an ought thing, right? The realm of biology is not the same thing. We actually make a distinction between nature and human nature. We say it's something different. So when you look out into the animal kingdom, you see an extraordinary range of sexual mating adaptations, right? All sorts of things that look very much like rape, and things that are much worse. Like my favorite is the praying mantis, who consumes the head of her copulating partner, right? I mean, that's where are the male praying mantises crying out for the manticide and rape, right? There are none. So you have to question, why are human beings doing it? Well, the thing about that is that we believe that we have choice. We have an adaptive choice. We have a choice space, and that the adaptation exists here, right? And if we say it's here, I think what we're really pointing to is the latest, from an evolutionary perspective, development in the human mind, which is the neocortex. And essentially what we're saying, this prefrontal cortex process develops the capacity to control older behaviors, older adaptations. And so when we say a man going into a room full of women in miniskirts, right, is going to, that's in that sexual selection environment, his desire to reproduce is going to increase immensely, right? But how much self-control he has, which is related to this structure built up in this new area, is going to also play an important factor. So
Right.
really,
as well as the role in us using that sorry, I want to talk about where our bit isn't just about changing individual response, but it's also about changing environmental cues. That's the one of the key points.
So in many cases, you can always wind the clock backwards, and you could say something like, well, why did the individual enter the room with all the women in miniskirts? Something like that. Why did the individual navigate to the porn website in the first place, wherein the chain of events would continue down, right? That's the kind of question that you end up asking, is when you wind it backwards. And that, I think that is actually the key to it. Winding the clock backwards through the proximal causes till you find what you can consider the ultimate cause, right? And when we discuss that in the sociological space, we discuss in the realm of behavior and morality, which is where this rape discussion, I think, really matters, because we all do truly believe that men and women can have self-control if they practice it. I believe that I believe that's what we can focus on, that we can remember that it's not necessarily about watching a bunch of rats behave how they behave. And it's not necessarily about watching 1,000 people or 10,000 people or 1,000,000 people behave how they behave. It's about what can you individually do in your life to gain self-control. Right? I think that is the key. And that was the message that Jordan B. Peterson was harping on for so long. And I think the one that helps people the most, right? I will never rape. It's easy. I'll never have that problem. I know it. Right? And that is only born out of the knowledge that I have self-control regarding that action. So there's always going to be this argument about evolutionary scientific adaptation traits, how they came about. But I think at the point that we're at now with our neocortex, that's the playground that we're in. So
I'm going to push back on that. I never rate thing, but maybe you can listen to it when you.
I will for sure.
All right, cool. Enjoy your day, Tyler.
No, it was good to see you again.
Yeah. Bye. My pushback for that can probably come into the side effects of these biological things. I think we can cover the biological stuff and then talk about the implications when it comes to policy or behavioral adaptations. Sorry, yeah. How do we adapt behavior to then take into account these biological adaptations? Because immediately for that bit that Tyler raised, Peterson talks about as well, which is there's these subpersonalities. And these are like little people who in your brain who have different desires. So, you could be like, especially in the NoFap community, it'll be like, I will never watch porn ever again or whatever. And then, but then your sperm builds up and your willpower gets smaller. And then, it'll be like, oh, it will be fine just watching like bikinis or whatever it is. And then, with each little hit of junk food, then your willpower gets less and less. But it's interesting because that frontal cortex, that neocortex Tyler talked about, with the ability to have this self-control and this behavioral adaptivity shuts down. So the subpersonality sees control over it. And that's where the role blending happens. And women know this, women know this so well. And we're in the context of mateship, which is women use sex as a weapon for exploiting and controlling men. And because it's unbelievably effective, providing the woman has leverage over, so I would imagine there would be some type of desirability requirement right there, right? So I would imagine if you get the, anyway, I don't want to go into that bit yet because that's more controversial.
But, I just wanted to bring up something interesting as well. When put into the situation of searching up something on Pornhub or something like that, the act of individual masturbation, there is no requirement of consent anywhere in that situation. And so we ought to be having a serious conversation on, not like us, but as a society, as questioning whether or not we ought to be incentivizing this type of sexual interaction where the masculine is put into an environment where they are rewarded by acting off of their mammalian brain, like because there's no, that is kind of like what it seems like the prefrontal cortex
but
is like doing.
Then you're taking power away from women to control men.
Well, I think I would be, I guess so, but
women are never okay with getting power that they gained getting rescinded.
I don't know if that's even the case though, because like if porn incentivizes men acting off of their biological urges without questioning consent, if that's what porn does, maybe we should have a conversation on that, like going through your brain on porn and all those types of things as well. But this hasn't really been studied as far as I know. Anyway, if that is the case that that's going on, it's taking away man's power to control themselves as well, because they're like giving up that power. And I don't know, it seems like the prefrontal cortex, or maybe it's not that direct mechanism, but the ability for self-control seems to be based upon the weighings of the costs and the rewards. So for the men in the Rape of Nanking,
within the specific environment.
Yes,
right.
Within that specific environment.
You can be as meta Zen-like as you want, but then the environment changes that. It's like same thing for working, right? Like for a writer, like Twitter may be more appealing, even though they set out that day to be, write 10 pages, right? So they have the meta goal in a Zen-like moment of being like, hey, I'm going to become this person or be this thing. But then, the environment changes, and now they're enacting a different subpersonality.
Yes. Okay. So here's going back to our discussion on Rape of Nanking. The Japanese soldiers had a cultural, moral meta-narrative for how they ought to behave and interact with people. And under that meta-narrative, there was no real consideration for foreigners as being part of their moral considerations, things like that. So the conscience that was built up through society within Japan didn't have much consideration for those other than themselves. That's probably, I don't know, might be me saying something.
Watch our discussion on Rape of Nanking for that one, or our World War II history session 2 weeks ago.
I talk about the difference between honor culture and dignity culture, whereas a honor culture is built upon the actions of an individual. Like the respect that you pay an individual is based upon how they act and like how they align themselves to the standard of honor, and they act honorably, so we give them honor, things like that. Whereas dignity culture, it has the underlying presupposition that each individual human being has an inherent worth within them and is deserving of respect and rights for how we ought to interact with them. Anyway, so in this specific environment and situation for the Japanese soldiers in Nanking, they had no retributive costs from their higher-ups. Basically, they knew that whatever they did in this situation wasn't going to come back on them. It seems like, and they didn't have the mental, like, indoctrinated conscience placed into them either for consideration of the Chinese women as being of part of their moral considerations. They didn't have that dignity culture. That's just the difference between the two, though there's more to it than that. And through that horrific combination of events that enabled just an incredible atrocity against the people of Nanking. And so taking that into account, we need to look at what is the best mechanisms for keeping those types of situations from occurring into the future. So if we can build up the conscience, the ability for self-control for the individual, so even when they are in such situations, their own individual self will be having that element of control within them to stop their biological urges from taking them too far or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, the balancing act there, right, is that it's a situation of competing interests, right? Because we say we're going to develop a conscience against rape, or we're going to develop a conscience against pornography, masturbation, right? Or a conscience against junk food, which is then to say we've now established a domain in which case, when observed, we consider the outcome of abstinence to be more beneficial than that reward. However, if we that development of self-resilience requires us to have pre-existing conceptual frameworks for dealing with likely exploitations of the strategies that may then present a better game. So for instance, like the Japanese entering into Nanking, you know, they may have, well, that's a hard example, right? But we can take like the act of, I don't know, let's take an act of junk food, for instance.
Okay, yeah.
Just to give an example, right? So you have the goal, this larger meta goal of I want to be healthy, right? But then for some reason, you may be feeling a little bit down, a bit low on energy. Maybe you're a bit sad. So you want some comfort food for the dopamine release, right? In which case, then there's this new competing game that is then saying, hey, we're more important now than the healthy goal. In fact, maybe eating a little bit of junk food today may achieve the healthy goal, right? Because, you know, you'll get the more energy, you'll get that comfort
more
food
efficient.
that could avoid a worse repercussion later. So the argument then for rape, right, is if we have this ultimate cause of reproductive success for men, mass reproductive success, which is possible, then, you know, if there's a genocide occurring, for instance, and there's zero cost to rape, then suddenly the goal of saying, hey, within the Christian context, I'm a loyal husband, which do not engage in those behaviors, and we're in a time when we don't have good knowledge about STIs, sexually transmitted infections, then there would be zero cost, perceived cost to that rape, in which case the goal then of like, hey, be a good Christian man, or engage in mass reproductive wins astronomically, you know, that one could become a more appealing game to play at that point. And it's the same thing with like drunk guys at parties or drunk girls. Like girl passes out on a couch and then some sleaze bag has sex with her, right? And it's just like, you know, like that sucks, but yeah. So, you know, but yeah, for that guy, then it's just like, you know, there's not particularly any risk involved in that. So, and like this also explains, like there's just so much behavior that, like same thing for porn, like it exploits the exact same thing. Oh, you're feeling a little bit sad. Hey, here's a whole bunch of sexy women who want to be your reproductive strategy, right? And it kind of tricks that behavior. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm the king. I got all the women. Okay, we've got some comments in here. So we've got a person called Subject Zero. So they are talking about adaptation byproduct. Mental illness is the issue. That was a few moments ago. So we'll go into that. So for instance, mental illness does not explain varying ejaculate size considering proximity to an unknown to female reproductive competition. perceived female reproductive competition. It doesn't explain many things in regards to this. Like certainly there's a mental illness or psychological side. So the environment will express cues during development within childhood, they argue, where a lack of a fatherly figure showing sexual restraint then causes the male child to then have less sexual restraint. And the same type of things can be seen in aggression. Boys who are not allowed to wrestle as children, which is generally engaged by fathers, will have less aggressive restraint, which will then have them become more disagreeable. But they've also said, Ben, you're a psychopath. Well, psychopathy is like a spectrum, and psychopath has like Machiavellian narcissism and sociopathy on it, which are all defined in different ways. And but on each of them, you're a spectrum, and when it becomes maladaptive, or rather kind of more problematic, then that's a concern. And I think that problematic side, well, it's hard to also say whether it's a concern.
I wanted to go off of
well, but from my knowledge, I'm not a psychopath, and certainly my history would not indicate that, because psychopaths, at least they generally don't fare too well in terms of trust.
Well, just in case you are, we better keep you in a situation where you're not gonna, those psychopathic tendencies don't find their way out. But
right,
yeah,
but I mean, like, you know, yeah, but yeah, like psychopathy, like, you know, generally when someone says you're a psychopath or whatever, or that's psychopathic behavior, is generally when they're failing to interpret a context besides psychopathy that would justify that behavior. It's the same thing as like all the corruption in the world is just due to greed. It's a failure to comprehend alternative explanations. So they fall back to kind of this, there's just a whole bunch of psychopaths exploiting everybody, rather than saying there's a whole bunch of environments and certain adaptive behaviors that then cause certain horrible things. So for instance, Ordinary Men was a selection of the population from Germany who did genocide against Jews, but they were just ordinary people.
Yeah, I wanted to get into what you were talking about with junk food. So if you think about it as like there are a compendium of drives within us, like for in order to sustain ourselves as an existing person. So let's say you've got one for hunger and you also have one for happiness, something like that. Say, and you're in a bad mood or something like that, and you have the understanding that, oh, when I eat sugary treats, that makes me happier. And at the same time, like if you're hungry, then you also require some sort of meal in order to sustain yourself. So those two drives kind of acting in coordination with each other can make you desire to eat sugary, like McDonald's food or something like that. And so that is a case where the pre-mammalian drives are kind of working in coordination with each other to drive us towards things that we, through our more intellectual understanding, know are things that are detrimental to us in the long run. By like eating junk food every day is something that is just going to just ruin your, you know, there's plenty of problems with eating unhealthy food. So we need to think about then if our biological drives are actually working us towards things that we know in our own minds are not to our best benefit for ourselves and for our society that we exist within and the world around us, then what can be done in order to keep those drives from getting the better of us? Especially like when you're hungry and you're angry and like upset. These are all things that diminish our prefrontal cortex in having control over our drives. It's like when we're put into situations like somebody slaps you in the face and your immediate reaction is fight or flight. This isn't something that you can rationally take control over. It's something that it saves your life in a lot of situations when you act without having to think things through. And so I don't know, it was something I was thinking about just in regards to like eating fast food. Like what could be done just as a quick fix for something like that? Like say each day your drives get the better of you and you eat fast food every day. If instead you, let's say, had a prefixed social interaction with somebody every single day, like say you and somebody else were also suffering from eating fast food and things like that. If you had a scheduled day every day of the week or something like that, where you both go meet at some other place, such as I don't know, so somewhere with healthier foods, Whole Foods or whatever, something like that, and then that was your method of dealing with both of those two drives, because that's the thing, like drives can be satisfied in multiple different ways. So meeting up with friends could be something that satisfies the happiness drive or something like that, and eating healthy food at Whole Foods or something like that would satisfy the nourishment drive, something like that. So there are situations, there are actions that can be taken place in order to stop our drives getting the better of us when we know that that the things that they're leading us down towards is ultimately for our detriment. Natha, do you have anything to add so far?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I was thinking about this to increase the costs of rape and reduce the benefits. That's basically what we can do. And we can do it on an individual level, but also on a societal level.
Yeah, so it's a good point. So, like, let's say there was somebody that was mentally ill that had a strong need for connection or a sexual drive holding over them. They would go out, like a psychopath would go out and seek out where they could derive the satisfaction of that drive within them. And so if they found somebody that, like, even if they were in just a town away from themselves, this is somewhere they aren't going to be recognized. So there's a lesser cost, let's say, of being recognized, or like in
being
the way
socially punished. Yeah,
social. Yeah, exactly. So they're like, even if they see your face, nobody's going to recognize them, and then they'll get away with it. That's like a calculation that might be taken in their mind. So that's the thing. Like, we can't just say that everyone who's a rapist is a psychopath, and then we're done with it, because there are psychopaths actually out there, and so we still need to think about how can we keep those psychopaths from going about doing this, because like whether you want to classify them as a psychopath or as a byproduct of their evolutionary history, taking control over them in dire situations or circumstances that are outside, or that are they see themselves as not having any recourse against. And yeah, we still need to consider, like, how can we avoid rapes from occurring still? So like anonymity is a way that rapists get away, and so if there was a way that anonymity could be taken away, then that could possibly decrease rape. So like maybe like the Chinese system, where of the social credit system, where you have cameras everywhere and facial recognition. That's at least one way in which.
Why do you go immediately to the most extreme example? A way easier example would be Tinder verifies people's passports or ID, that gets matched, or a girl, before she engages in any sexual conduct, takes a picture of the guy's ID, or don't have alcohol when you're mating with a stranger, when you're engaging on a date with a stranger, right? Because because and have your date in a public place, or use a chaperone to guide your courtship, right? So, because I mean, we're talking about like in like rape in a Western society, then we're generally talking about like date rape, drugs, the use of drugs, or we're talking about when a woman was alone at night, engaging more risky behavior, so walking alone, whatever it is, without a chaperone, without a guide, or they're engaging in risky mateship tactics, which would be having alcohol on dates or engaging in groups, like in the nightclub or something like that.
So there's some stats that was on page 67. Okay. I guess this is from Kalikman et al. In 1998. Report that 42% of surveyed women living in low-income housing in the state of Georgia had been raped. And Eisenhower reported, that is another study, reported that a female residing in an inner city stood a 1 in 77 chance of being raped, whereas in the more affluent areas, the risk was 1 in 2,000, and in the richer suburbs, it was 1 in 10,000. Also, women of lower socioeconomic levels are more fearful of rape. This pattern, coupled with the strong tendency for a rapist and his victim to live within the same vicinity, is another study, indicates that men of lower socioeconomic status are overrepresented among rapists. So this is kind of like what Peterson talks about in the inequality driving crime, where if you're in a situation where it feels like your actions cannot garner the goals that you're seeking out through honest means, let's say through the system itself, then you're going to switch to work outside the system in order to satisfy those needs instead, which is, very, very scary. But at least we have a good indication of like what areas require the most change. Mm-hmm.
Well, not necessarily. So the reason why there's more people in the socioeconomic is because the need, which is they can't get the resources like through what is considered ethical in that culture. So therefore they are forced to then engage to meet those needs via alternative. The other thing is more that, so the idea is whenever the cost of exploitation is higher than the cost of honesty, or dignity, I guess, then you will get the exploitation. So for instance, like the Yakuza, do we really think that these great businessmen or whatever it is, or Pablo Escobar, right, they really think that these people like struggled to compete in the normal workforce? No, they would have been great businessmen, right? But the advantage of, like Pablo Escobar, like his net worth was like $1 billion or $1 trillion. Like, it's insane. Like it's bringing like $1 billion like so quickly. So it's just like, whenever the option of doing something unethical is more rewarding, then it is actually economically incentivized to choose whatever is going to be most rewarding.
I see. So like in those poorer neighborhoods where people have, let's say, rough lives, and in order to, so their sadness drive or happiness drive is very low. One method of relieving that, similar to the junk food, things like that, is to use hard drugs such as cocaine or heroin, meth, things like that. And so there is this new, I guess, incentive for people to meet the needs of the people around them by, what are you doing, Ben? Okay.
I'm keeping my partner awake, so I'm gonna relocate.
Okay, good. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So in those poorer
I'll turn my
neighborhoods,
webcam off, but I'll still be listening.
okay, yeah. In those poorer neighborhoods, there is that in order to maximize your social status and perhaps even sexual status as well, if those are the things driving us, then by raising money through selling illegal drugs that provides happiness for the people in your community, then yeah, that's something that's people are going to be driven towards.
Yeah, and these studies that you talked about, they also indicate that, like, when they can't get willing women, then they might rape them instead.
Yeah,
because that's the only way they can get access to sex.
Yeah, and so the common feminist response to this is that, yeah, if a man can't get a woman because of his height or his money,
Wait,
and
it's not specifically access to sex, because otherwise they could pay for sex or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or achieve sex otherwise. It's
but they
access to reproductive potential.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, you know, they could just find the I don't know, the I'm not going to go into all the horrible examples, but there's ways to, you know, acquire sex, and even like the illusion of sex, like masturbation or rape an animal or whatever it is, right? And so it's specifically, so, you know, masturbation is kind of like hero and reward level, whereas, hold up, let me turn my video off so I don't risk showing anything. But yeah, so masturbation would be like a low reward tier, whereas the goal, the ultimate thing, would be reproduction, which is why rape is more preferable than masturbation, which is like, that's okay. That's obviously context specific. Don't sound like
I don't know if it's
but
directly.
that's why rapists would choose rape over masturbation. That's the correct soundbite to use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah, if someone talk for, I would need to disappear for like a few minutes.
Okay, sure. Did you want to add something, Natha?
No.
Okay.
You were saying something, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So there is the dilemma currently within Western American society of a subsection of the population that are known as incels, where they have recognized within themselves, be it whether it is illusory or objectively speaking, that they are non-sexually viable, let's say, from the perspective of the women that they interact with, or just through what they're seeing online and different things like that, and through their interactions with females. This yeah, what can be done for them in this situation? Because it seems like the common response from online feminists and things like that are to dismiss them as being misogynistic pricks, basically, because they think that they deserve love or sex or anything like that, when in fact they don't actually. They are just a dismissal of them, because sexual choice lays entirely within the hands of the females. And so if it is the case that all females that you interact with are dismissing you, where does that leave the incels, essentially? Not that I'm an incel or anything like that, but still, it is threatening, let's say, to our social structures if there is a congregation of people that have been rejected by society and are going to be driven to do more heinous things, let's say. Well, so far, I don't believe there's been any like major, that I can think of, that has been directly tied to the incel community or anything like that. I'm sure plenty of rapists were maybe had the same mentality as the incels online before committing the rape. So yeah, this is something that I don't think they even really touch on it in the book exactly, for the male mentality of them. But
yeah, so the best thing would be to make these men attractive to women. Like not all of them wouldn't be possible, but maybe like okay, if they have no social skills and no education and no job and no physical attractiveness, like okay, it will be difficult for them. But could we change some of these things? Could we make it easier for them to get a job, or give them an education in some way?
Yeah,
so
that's a good point. So what drives, let's say, unethical behavior is the, like as we brought up with the drug dealer, is the impression that by using the what's the opposite of taboo, like inline or mainline strategies that are approved of by society, our goals are not being met through these strategies taking place. So let's say, like, if they did the kind of set forward, just put yourself out there, meet as many women as you can, things like that, and if that is still proving itself to be not successful towards the goals that they have in mind of, like, having a stable relationship with a mate, then they will be driven to take strategies that go against the cultural ethic that we have in place. So yeah, this is a dangerous thing that's like is out there right now, and we dismiss it at our peril.
Yeah, and I think that, like, some things could actually be done to make some of these men attractive to some women. And
well, we see this with Peterson. Like, that's what Peterson is doing, which is taking men who were lost Peter Pan boys and converting them into adult hero archetypes, fairly successfully. Well, probably more successfully than otherwise, which is why his rise to popularity has been so high. The game he's providing is one that is more rewarding to his audience. So yeah, that's what's happening there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess maybe if we could bring in the kind of MGTOW talking point that's kind of laid out a lot of the time, the problem of hypergamy within a sexually free society, where what's the Tinder stats or something like that, where 80% of the women.
It's one of those
like
what
a
is
Pareto
it?
distribution.
Yeah, Pareto distribution. So 80% of women, 20% of men get access to 80% of the women. So 80% of men fight over the bottom 20% of women. So
this is the recurrence of a polygynous society, or it's like the same structures as kind of a polygynous society. Like I think orangutans. Like there was a bit of that where it talks about how the larger orangutans have access to a lot of the different females, because they're the largest and they're so most capable of protecting the females. Whereas the smaller male orangutans will kind of lurk on the outskirts and will actually rape females that don't have a stronger male beside them. So that is a kind of situation where this imbalance is at place. And so it could be Jordan Peterson's greatest, not hang up, but the greatest social taboo that he's made was discussing enforced monogamy. And so this is something that yeah, in environments where there isn't some sort of socially enforced one man per one woman situation, then we will get the hypergamous Pareto distribution where, or polygynous, or what's the other, polyamorous relationships, and leaving basically a lot of the young men to be akin to the orangutan, those younger orangutans as well. So where was I going with that? But yeah.
Well, so this is where the social strategies come into play. So for instance, married women experience less rape than single women, as well as less muggings, and as well, women who operate publicly in groups experience less hardship than women who don't. So because single females are, of course, vulnerable to men, especially for one is the weakness, but secondly is the lack of witness. As soon as you add that witness, then you know, so for instance, you could say, well, like a gang rape would still happen regardless of strength, right? Because then it's overpowering force. But a gang rape is still going to happen against an individual woman rather than two women or three women, depending. But I mean, then you have like the issue of like the Germany New Year's party or whatever it was that happened a few years ago, where, or for instance, molestation on overcrowded trains in the third world. These are things which the anonymity of the perpetrators works in their favor. So it's, but yeah, cultures develop strategies for avoiding that. So enforced monogamy is such a powerful force against the side effects of hypergamy and polygyny, the exploitative side effects of those strategies. Monogamy has worked terrifically well because it pairs women at early ages with husbands and support systems that serve to protect them. And secondly, it makes male-on-male competition less because now men are cooperating with other men and women are cooperating with other men rather than fighting over reproductive potential with their gender. Because especially for arranged marriages, like arranged marriages are fantastic for intergender cooperation.
So this is interesting. If the society that we have currently might be incentivizing polygyny over enforced monogamy, where I'm not sure if polygyny is the correct word, but there's another term that I'm not sure exactly of it, but it's like monogamy at one point in time. So like you're never going to be with multiple mates.
Zero monogamy.
Zero monogamy. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Serial.
Serial monogamy. Okay.
But even then, the issue is. Sorry, I know you were going to make a point, but let me cut it off before you do.
That's good. Actually.
So the issue is. It's not polygyny because polygyny is one man, multiple vaginas. Literally, that's what the term means. Whereas it's polyamory, which is women. So Tinder enables women to have multiple men and men to have multiple women. The more sexual value the woman has, the more multiple men she will accrue. Whereas the men, the more sexual value they have, the more women that they will accrue. Now, the women, however, do have biological their sexual selection strategies are not favorable to polyamory due to it not being a strategy that incentivizes resources allocation to them, which is why women have such psychological trauma at a male cheating, as well as such viciousness to other women. That is why there is hypergamy as a result of female to female competition. Female to female competition is exorbitant kind of thing. And that's like makeup. That's the fashion industry. That's the beauty industry. That's like the fake tit industry, like everything, right? Which is all about, or even just like probably media as well, like all the gossip and rumors, things like that, female aggression being used, which is, you know, women, empowerment of women is involved, focus is about leveling up women to give them better access to better mates, which is less toxic masculine mates. However, the issue there is if you level up women more than the average male, then they're going to eliminate a sizable portion of men from the reproductive economy, in which case that can have its own repercussions. So also the issue is hypergamy is very strict in its requirements, so much so that women believe 80% of men are below average or something like that, which below average should be 50% rather than 80%, right? So it yeah, so it's not just one man with multiple women, it's a woman with multiple men. And secondly, the issue here is that I guess I should elaborate on that resources argument. So for instance, female reproductive strategy is best rewarded when female accrues the resources of one man, or can get sustained resource accruement from males, specifically one man. So monogamy, just as it serves a man in guaranteeing that the offspring is his, it serves the woman by guaranteeing that resources are exclusively hers. So that's the trade, the battle that is being played. And it also says when we grow old, we're there to take care of each other. Once we're useless, we're there. So, but it's also the investment battle, which is that the man accrues more resources as he gets older. So he could completely screw the woman by divorcing her once she's reached post-reproduction. But the trade here is that because reproduction is so incredibly valuable, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, then that trade is done, which is to say we will marry you in your most fertile time to then invest your reproductive time for the male resources. And then it's like a reciprocal thank you for the caring of that female in old age. Which is why divorce is only, like marriage is only good if it actually facilitates no divorce. As soon as you include divorce, then women are actually screwing themselves over incredibly, with the exception of abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other issue is with Tinder specifically is that because of the hypergamy situation and because of the pairing with the men, we know also from other statistics, Stefan Molyneux has a great video like The Truth About Sex or something, and it is that the likelihood of a successful marriage depends on 0 sexual partners before marriage, which is if you only have sex after marriage, you have like a 90% chance of marriage succeeding. Whereas if you have had sex even before marriage, it drops to like 60%. If you've had one partner outside of marriage, then it drops down to 40%. And then after that, it's pretty much, it doesn't really matter how many partners you have. But then I think it drops down like 10% or something with more than one partner or whatever.
Yeah, so that's kind of the thing.
I could be inflating those stats a little bit, but it's like that.
Women are always comparing the partner that they're currently with the partners that they've had previously. So if there was ever at one point that like a woman slept with George Clooney, something like that, any other relationships that she's going to be having in the future is always going to be in reference back to that night with George Clooney, something like that. And maybe even a lot of like built up assumptions about that night or things like that as well. So yeah, it's it's so weird. Like as we go through these types of conversations, like after doing this for 2 years, it's like we just keep getting more and more puritanical and conservative just through what we discuss. But actually, maybe in order to go against that, this is something that I'm still, let's say.
Well, I would say probably ethically conservative, however, still socially liberal, because one of those things that differences the West, like Christianity, from Islam is Islam prohibits exposure to temptation, and that is also why their society is regressive to an extent, because that prohibition to temptation also prohibits them or inhibits their ability to revise when their culture is maladapted to current circumstances. So in that situation, the West has the side effect to say we will give everyone individual freedom or social freedom, so you can shoot your foot off because we consider the revision cost to society to outweigh the cost of your personal devastation. Plus, your personal devastation rewards those who can exploit it economically, and that's considered to be a good thing in capitalistic societies.
Yeah. It also means that you get people like in the tech bubble that are providing like the digital version of cocaine, and then people are able to just get addicted to that and then waste their life away. But yeah.
All right. Unfortunately, I'm tethering, so
Okay.
hold up. Maybe I need to just buy some more data. Yeah. No. Okay, I won't do that. All right. We'll see how we go. But I think I'll just tether, which is unfortunate because it means I got the damn Bevry logo instead, rather than my avatar.
That's okay. Better than,
yeah. Do we have anything to add to that point? Otherwise, we could actually. I do have something to add to that point because I wrote specifically a note in. Oh, okay. Someone can talk while I try and search for my notes here.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, you want to say something, Natha?
Yeah. I don't know if I have like formulated the thought yet, but yeah, I think women. I think I saw a study about how many women are childless without, like, they want to have children, but they don't have any children, and it was like a pretty high percentage. So I think it was in Sweden. And I think that's also like a result of this. Like they think they can get like a very attractive man, but they really can't. And they can get an attractive man for like one night, but they don't understand that it doesn't translate to like long term.
Yeah,
mates.
Which is kind of crazy, right? Because I mean, it's a trade which they're losing. Because what it says is the man can win your reproduction access, but you don't get to win his resources. And women confuse them, like I think there is this, I don't know whether or not there's a controversial opinion, perhaps, where the women define power by, like, their worldview is orientated around power, because that is so it seems the evolutionary strategy that facilitates sexual selection within humans and many other animals is that the male, because of the disposable nature in terms of their reproductive capacity, so you can kill 99 men and 1 man can still repopulate the society, is that the men are disposable, they're stronger, and they're more, therefore, adapted to interfacing with the unknown and with going into the unknown to fend off dragons to get chests of gold to then bring back. So it's about resource acquisition and creation. And then they bring the resources back to the women, which are then protected by the men of the society against external threat, like warring tribes. And the women take those resources and then distribute them, redistribute them within the family. So the women's orientation around resources is about redistribution, whereas the male's orientation around resources is around creation. And we can see this with exactly where women choose to go in terms of the workplace or in terms of government policy as well, which is that men go into jobs of resource creation and women go into jobs of resource redistribution, which is HR, policy, law, legal, sociology, social engineering, all the rest. Whereas men go into engineering and other things. And probably depending on the IQ of the man, the more innovative they are, or the more of a tool that they are for the innovators. Or the women's strategy here is to always be looking at what others have in terms of resources, because their goal is to ensure equitable distribution within the family, because there's a balancing side here, which is that, say, within Sparta, in times of war, it is not advantageous ecologically to give resources to weak or deformed babies so their skulls are crushed. Because in times of war, you must incentivize strength and valor. Those are the things that will promote sustainability. However, that is more masculine, whereas situations could certainly change within a society where now peace ensues, in which case you require cooperation, more feminine collaboration, more peering instead of masculine warring and aggression internally. So then internally, those kids which would have had the skulls crushed because they weren't the strongest or killed within gladiator matches may have actually been better at facilitating cooperation intra-tribe. So therefore, the women's is a counterbalance to the male's discrimination for strength, whereas the woman also, distributes. Yeah.
And even in like areas of peacetime, then you'll have all of the aggressive males that are still interacting with society with, say, like a lesser degree of moral consideration of like what they do and like things like that, and they're just being pushed right into our prison system, like within the United States. Is such a huge percentage of the population is just wasting away in there. And so, like, yeah, in those situations where in the past Spartans might have been what was necessary for war, now in 2019, the Spartans of yesteryear are the prison inmates of today. Sorry, that was taking you off track, though.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just going to pay for some more data, because this conversation really requires a face, I think, rather than just a thing. So we have, so then this makes sense of why women focus along power, which is resource acquisition. And where men, why that subversion of policy happens so quickly against men, because men are too busy engineering, and while the tech company is being completely taken over by ideologues, you could say. So instead, we have the situation here of, so with Tinder as an example of this. So Tinder is crazy because it is the dating service for women. And women, like, it's the only dating service which women pay for, which is surprising. The people who pay for Tinder are overwhelmingly women, it seems, which is why the marketing is catered towards women. Women are their clientele. So you have the situation here where the women are orientated around looking for power and resource acquisition, and they see, they give access. It's like the same thing where groupies go to concerts to try and all hook up. Like, you have 10 women all offering sex to the lead singer or even the drummer or whatever.
Well, because
right?
the men there accrue a great deal of resources in the future. So there's kind of like an investment that would be made by the groupie towards a potentially successful rock star or something like that. Because then by the time that they become famous, then they could have a share of those resources in order to sustain their progenitors.
Yeah, correct. So, so what's happening here is, they do, again, this is a good evolutionary strategy because it works. Like, that's why this particular strategy exists, because it is advantageous. So if you have free competition of mateship, which is what the West currently facilitates with its divorce laws and allowing extramarital sex, is that it is saying we are opening up relationships to the free market. And the side effect of that is then the game that is being played is the evolutionary strategy. That's now the buzzword, I think, after reading this book. I never would have said evolutionary strategy, right? But the strategy yeah, so I'm going to continue overusing that term until I find the right balance of when it's inappropriate and appropriate. Like, yeah, so then, yeah, for the strategy there is or the game that is being played is to say, in modern society, we now consider free markets, sexual relationships to be more valuable because it incentivizes reproduction of the most resourceful men and the most fertile women, or the most attractive, beautiful, whatever it is, the most sexually valuable women. And this also seems to make sense when a population explodes, because you also want to reduce resource consumption of that population and get the population also down. So you're saying we are okay with the majority of people not repopulating, which would have happened through arranged marriage. So you eliminate fertility or reproduction from the society in a mass scale by eliminating arranged marriage or marriage without divorce, which is a population growth stat and economical growth strategy. And instead you say, we're going to completely cut the population by allowing only the most successful to reproduce, which is then why we see such exorbitantly high rape within low economic men, which is now there's no chance for them to get access to women who now with Tinder get access to the top men, or even reasonable men, even if they are ugly. So they can always find a better man than the local geography will be able to provide. And so then the men, you've just eliminated 80% of the men from reproduction. And in a liberal, socially liberal sexual market, and in which case the men will then decide based on their individual strategy that that's not a strategy that is worthwhile to them, because now it means that for a few million years of life, they're the first ones to fail to ever reproduce. So that's not particularly good from an individual evolutionary strategy. However, maybe the authors reject this, but maybe there's group selection here, which is that the reason we do this social revision is because it is successful at group selection, which is, you can imagine it, which is the society that continued to practice monogamy externally would have exponential population growth, because every husband and wife would be having children, and it would require unlimited resources, which we don't have. So the situation of Japan would happen, where emigration outside the nation through war or consent, like the need for more resources would occur. So then that forces their hand. So that society would be wiped out if individual strategy was the only thing at play. So Richard Dawkins' group selection, or group altruism, gene altruism, which is, you could say, memes, would then take preference, because the society that can dispose of 80% of the population while adapting is going to be a more successful population in the long term, rather than potentially, I don't know, we'll be reading the book, the next two books, trying to get a counter argument to that, but at least that's the problem space.
There's a lot there that I think went a lot over my head. Okay. I don't even know what. I do want to say that, at least that, just to clarify, Richard Dawkins isn't any form of group selectionist, as far as I'm aware. And the memes that...
Well, Richard Dawkins specifically, he talked about altruistic suicide, which is group selection, because it says that because there is no evolutionary individual advantage to suicide. So
okay,
altruistic
So you're not talking about
provided.
group selection. You're talking about like, let's say an uncle in a family, or actually, let's just work with bees, because that's something easy to work off of. He uses bees in order to point out how the selection is within the gene replicators. So where the gene replicators are, that's where selection takes place. And so for bees, the worker bees are all what's their word? Sterile, and so they have no capacity to reproduce or anything like that. Yet the queen bee does have the capacity to reproduce. And so instead of working for their own progenitors of their own, because they're sterile, they work towards the protection of the queen, and thus the colony itself. That's where you can get suicide in order to protect the gene replicator that they came from.
Right. Yeah, well, it depends where you're drawing the group boundary around, because you're not drawing then, you could, so for instance, gene replication strategies are not individual replication strategies, because many individuals within that gene could perish. So therefore, it's about the group around the gene surviving, which then would encompass many individuals while also being against other genes.
Yeah, so like the mother devotes resources towards the children, even though they could instead, if they were like only individually driven, devote all resources towards themselves, and then the children that they have is just left to die. And then they die themselves, and so there's nothing that reproduces. So there's that drive to devote resources towards the most likely individual that will carry those genes forward into the future. Something like that within Dawkins' theories, as far as I'm aware. Now, where Brett Weinstein and I would believe the authors of this book also fall somewhat in line with Brett Weinstein. They kind of dismiss Dawkins' ideas of memes, where the memes themselves have a capacity to reproduce themselves and thus drive the behaviors of the individuals to do things that are actually not in replication of their genes, but instead in replication of the memes themselves. And there's an element that I can agree with Dawkins on this, where the individual who believes that this new strategy will actually reward them and their genes, they will take up that strategy even if they are unaware. So that actually takes place in the mental space. They'll take up that strategy even though it might have detrimental outcomes in the future. So you can imagine, say, like communism as some sort of like parasitic meme, that the workers that saw that they were in a situation where they were not accruing resources fairly, something like that, thought that communism would be a better strategy to adopt in order to have a more a better resource accruement and a better society. Essentially, they take on communism, put it into action, and then the memes itself corrupt the system and dies itself. So that's an element where memes can become parasitic towards the host. But and so I don't know. I'm kind of like caught in the balance between Dawkins and Weinstein and Palmer and Thornhill, because that's the thing. Our genetic strategies cannot foresee the future. So what may have been a evolutionarily successful genetic strategy in the past may not be still a genetically successful strategy into the future. So it would look exactly like a parasitic meme, even though it was genetically driven.
Right.
Brett Weinstein has the phrase, culture is biological. Like everything that's cultural is actually biological. It's just the second layer to biology, essentially. Something like that. And there's a statement, something akin to that within this book, which is why I kind of paired those three kind of together in their thinking.
There's a extension to that, which is because there's a risk with the saying what was previously sufficient may no longer be sufficient, has the risk of throwing out everything as it could no longer be sufficient. So it's something that kind of leans its way to nihilism, to say, well, how do we know that this is still an adequate strategy? So I like to phrase it in this way, which is, what used to be what used to be sufficient may now be insufficient, but it could also in the future be sufficient again, right? So, and then that gives the example of why we have certain genes that only activate in like your grandchildren rather than your direct children. So they'll be dormant, and then in certain generations, then they activate. As that, perhaps that's the strategy, that to kind of say, you know, these genes may actually be maladaptive if they're expressed in, if they're activated in every single generation. So instead, we're going to activate their behaviors only in every second, third, fourth generation instead. And then that randomness ensures the gene's survival without complete dominance of that gene.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And I guess this book, I think, has definitely given me a much better understanding of like Brett Weinstein's position on evolution itself being kind of immoral or amoral when looking at it through a scientific lens. Because like there's a I guess I think he's talked about this on Joe Rogan or something like that. Like, since you're an evolutionary biologist, why aren't you just like devoting as much sperm to sperm banks as possible? Because like that would be the evolutionarily best strategy to take on through the current means that we have at our disposal, something like that. And yeah, Brett Weinstein's position is that the evolutionary mechanisms that propagate genes is not necessarily what we would consider moral through our sociocultural standards at this point in time. So because of that, well, especially if it's the case,
it's such placating though to the feminine, because what he's doing is he's placating that the male strategy of infinite fertilization is not a adaptive strategy. which is
No,
then
he's
to
saying
then,
it is an adaptive strategy, but it.
well, otherwise he would be in the sperm bank. So the argument there is he's saying is that resource acquisition. Okay.
He's
So-
not okay through the prefrontal, through our ability to think and rationalize things. He's not considering the most adaptive strategy to be what he devotes his time towards. So that's like completely contradictory to the evolutionary process. So like even though he could devote like tons of sperm, but maybe that's too much, but to
Right.
all of the things. This isn't something that is driving his behavior. Like if, let's say, if his genes knew what was at the disposal for them to make themselves propagate to their greatest degree, then that would be the strategy that they would take place. But through where we are currently and how we evaluate things and think about things, what is most adaptive is no longer what we devote our resources and energy towards.
All right. Maybe I overspoke on the placating. However, I still find the statement disagreeable because so we consider, because it seems at least the criticism then directed to him would be that, like the proposition is that evolutionary strategy is for a male to impregnate as many women as possible. So sperm donation is the best evolutionary strategy. And then he's rejecting that. But that's only the male evolutionary strategy. Whereas the female evolutionary strategy would be sexual strategy would be for resource acquisition, identify the best resource provider. So what he's saying is instead of doing the masculine one of just complete insemination, instead I'm going to instead do this, I guess this is where masculine and feminine break down, but instead he's going to say, I'm going to now to appeal to feminine sexual strategy by acquiring resources instead. Whereas the appeal to male sexual strategy, we know, is porn, which is it's ejaculation with the most minimal effort and less cost, right?
Yeah.
Which is why, like, even, which is like,
well, porn
crazy.
is like the maladaptive trait that's, the addiction to porn would be a maladaptive trait based upon prior evolutionarily successful strategies. Whereas masturbating whereas now donating sperm to sperm banks would be the most successful masculine trait or most adaptive strategy to adopt if one's agenda was the evolutionary drive.
Right. Yeah, maybe, we shouldn't say masculine here. We should just specifically say male and female. So the male sexual strategy is low cost ejaculation, whereas the female sexual selection strategy is resource acquisition, because the masculine and gender, like the masculine would also facilitate, like we masculine is created then from both of those to say that the ideal man is one who probably participates in a little bit of both. Depends on how you define it in your culture, right? So for instance, in a polyamorous culture, the most masculine one would be resource acquisition and plenty of fertilization. And whereas in some cases, where in a more monogamous culture, then the most masculine man would be resource acquisition without polyamorous fertilization. Whereas in a aggressive masculine culture, the masculine man would be the one who doesn't do any resource acquisition. They just rape and plunder everywhere instead.
The Genghis Khan strategy.
Yeah. So the only other thing I wanted to add on to all that other stuff I added on would be okay, no, my brain's resetting.
Okay.
No. Nata, do you have okay, wait. Sorry. I found the quote about the Tinder thing. So before we move away from that, let me read this out for what they raise in this book. So It is well known that these experiences tend to co-occur in rearing environments and are felt to mold. Hold on, I should hide my notebook here. It is well known that these experiences tend to co-occur in rearing environments and are felt to mold an individual's sexual strategy, leading to earlier sexual maturity and intercourse in both sexes and in boys to disenfranchisement and juvenile delinquency. The context for that will be revealed later. One developmental experience emphasized by Malamuth and his colleagues is a male's perception of rejection by potential mates and an associated history of non-committal heterosexual mateships. Men emerge from this developmental background with a perception of reduced ability to invest in women, an expectation of brief sexual relationships with women, and a reduced ability to form enduring relationships, a coercive sexual attitude towards women, and an acceptance of aggression as a tactic for obtaining desired goals. This model, then, is a version of the male deprivation hypothesis that emphasizes lack of enduring and committed sexual relationships rather than lack of sexual access. It is an explicit evolutionary developmental model of men's sexual coercion. Malamuth has tested some of its central predictions and has found support for it in his ability to identify men with sexually coercive tendencies. This model, however, can be viewed as a hypothesis that rape is an incidental effect of men's sexual adaptations other than rape, or as a hypothesis that rape reflects a particular developmental adaptation to stimuli associated with low probabilities of forming long-term relationships with women. So it talked about, this was about the environmental cues that cause this adaptation towards rape. So it was, the chapter kind of outlined the environmental cues that trigger activation of non-consensual sex require in the male's upbringing a lack of fatherly sexual restraint, as well as access or exposure to vulnerable women. And if those two environmental cues happen during the male's upbringing, then they orientate his worldview towards a value system that then becomes exploitative, which facilitates behavior that increases the likelihood of rape, which actually makes, they didn't ever argue this, they just stated that association. However, so they didn't argue why that association particularly exists, but I would then posit that association exists because it increases the genetic fitness in those situations where the males are exposed to those things, which is lack of fatherly sexual restraint paired with access to vulnerable females. Situations like this, war and genocide, right? So, for instance, in genocide, the males are eliminated and females are vulnerable. Therefore, in those situations, you're in an upbringing where males are incredibly highly disposable and female selection. So, actually, we should back up a little bit. So, the idea that for the psychological cost of the reason why female selection orientates itself around resources is, yeah, again, because pregnancy is incredibly costly for women, as well as maternity of the child for 25 years or so. So each child is a very defining factor in a female's right, which is why liberals cry over the idea of not having abortions, because the consequence of following through with a undesired pregnancy is catastrophic, which is why celibacy exists in the first place. So the thing, yeah, so the thing with rape, of why we all don't rape, is because female selection improves fitness of the species or of the group by promoting, because female selection orientates itself around the most resourceful men. So in situations of that, as Peterson outlines, are stable, that allow resource acquisition through generations, then resource acquisition is the thing to aim for. So Peterson outlines, and this is outlined in the developmental of culture, which is in hunter-gatherers, it wasn't stable to progress wealth through generations. Whereas we develop agriculture, that then developed the nuclear family, because one would now have land property and resources, materialism, to then accrue and then invest into children or propagate through the generation of inheritance of the land. So now we have wealth propagation through a family. However, in times of instability, we are less inclined to go for an 80-year career or to invest in a 300-year-old building, because who's to say that building or that career will still be worthwhile in 50 years or 100 years. So instead, we then adapt and the female evolutionary strategy is the counterbalance here to then say, we will reward who is most resourceful in situations of stability, because that increases the most fitness. But again, in situations of instability, resources mean nothing, because they can be taken at any moment. And these are things like war, so war, genocide, natural disasters, volcanoes, all these things, all things that also eliminate large portions of the population, which then would require insemination from fewer and fewer men. And in which case, again, because of this large elimination, the traits that are then going to be rewarded there is not resourcefulness, but valor and strength, protection and aggression, defense and aggression. So instead, this is then to say that the female sexual strategy is no longer valid. Valid is fine. Correct.
It's no longer successful.
Yeah, reproductively, or I don't know, evolutionary rewarding in that proximate situation. So then the rapist. So this is the interesting argument here, which is that the
You cut out. I think, okay, let me, since he cut out, I think I see where he's getting at, where in the environment where young men grow up without a father figure in the home, since that was one of the bases in the books discussing. Oh, you back? You can hear the audio, but you're still frozen. Oh, now I don't hear anything.
Yeah, I don't hear anything either.
Okay. So just to I guess try to articulate the point that he's making, that young men raised in homes without fathers is potentially something that is selecting the non-consensual strategy within men, or maybe not that as directly as that, but is still activating the strategy that is more viable, I guess, within wartime, or where there's, let's say, chaos. Where if it is the case that, oh boy, how to okay, so what he was saying was, in environments where there is less men and more women, then this is, I guess it can kind of be looked at in multiple ways, where it is both, it's from the genes perspective, there is a untapped resources of gene propagation that is there. So the unethical rapist strategy would be successful in those environments, which is something we need to definitely consider. We need to be prepared for, where in an environment where, okay, so in the selfish gene, Dawkins lays out this game theory experiment where I think he uses birds for this, where in altruistic groups, those can be most successful. But as soon as you get a selfish individual in that group, where they don't give up any resources, but they only accept the altruistic resources from the others, then the selfish individual will be most propagated, to the point where you create a group that is entirely selfish, and because it's entirely selfish, it'll die off because no one's actually putting in the effort to gather resources. And so there's always going to be this balance or interplay between the selfish and the altruistic, where you can't have too many altruists, because all it takes is one selfish individual to deflower that environment. And you can't have too many you can't have the opposite either, because selfish, if you have too many, because there's going to be no, everyone's going to gather resources individually and not altruistically spread it forward through time, like forward in time. Like, I'm sharing with you so that you'll share with me when I'm in a position of weakness, something like that.
So the evolutionarily stable strategy is what he calls grudgers, people who are altruistic when they get something in return, but not otherwise.
It's what was that in another thing, it refers to it as he does use it as grudgers, but there's another one that's also used where I can't remember. It's been a while since I saw it, but exactly. So they're I don't know where to go from there, but I think that's where Ben was kind of talking about, where in those more chaotic environments, then the unethical strategy becomes successful. Whereas within the orderly environments, where people's attempts to manifest their goals actually are rewarded with their goals, then that is something that can be stable, and people can benefit from
get something for investing in.
Exactly. So there's something I was thinking about a little earlier, where I just wrote down, ethics is our ability to intelligently design evolution towards our ideal goals. So like instead of like, all of morality is basically like thinking about like, how ought the world look like? What do we want it to look like? And then what can we do to make the world fit within that idea space? And so when we give ourselves these types of rules, we're like, say, completely becoming a vegan, something like that, where I am adopting this rule set of ethics, where I'm no longer going to eat meat, and then say you get more people doing that as well. There's a shared ethic between them that they can utilize and grow from. So like, if it's healthier to be vegan, then this would be more adaptive of an ethic to take on. Whereas there's also the problem where we have our drives calling us towards fast food, something like that. And if we were to listen to our drives at all times, then we would be addicted to fast food and become fat and no longer as evolutionarily fit in the future, and also just no longer we would be giving up our future well-being for our present well-being. So, yeah. Are you back, Ben? He's joined, but still can't hear him or see him or anything like that. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say something about morality. Yeah. I think morality, like how we want the world to work, but more like how we want society to work, or like our cooperation with other individuals.
Yeah, it's kind of I don't know. He was kind of making the divide between masculine strategies and feminine strategies, and I'm not. It might be. I don't know where to categorize morality in that terms, because in some ways, yeah, I don't know if you can directly gender morality. I know, like, I think Jung and Neumann sort of do that with the tyrannical king, or the great father, as being kind of the, well, I guess there's different forms of morality, really, because, like, taking from Jonathan Haidt, you have the elements of morality that are more like giving honor towards those in authority, or like respecting police officers, things like that, which is built within kind of the authority axiom of Jonathan Haidt's, like, I think 6 principal models of morality, or the moral foundations theory. And then it might, I don't know. I know there was talk of like an addition, maybe with property, but I'm not. Yeah, at least there's the main 5 I know for sure. And then you also have the other, the care harm foundation, which is more empathetic, and he brings up how this is very much a more feminine or matronly kind of element of morality, where resource distribution towards the children, things like that, rather than like the Spartan strategy of anyone that's weak deserves to be thrown off the cliff, something like that, which you could say is much more male oriented.
Yeah, but I guess there are sometimes different rules for males and females, like moral rules in societies.
Such as
yeah, I don't have an example, but
okay.
like, yeah, how to
I guess, yeah, there's kind of the rules that we have, just still on the topic of rape. There's multiple ways in which we can enforce rules, where we could enforce rules upon men, so that let's like take a Clockwork Orange strategy and completely psychologically indoctrinate them into feeling a repulsive sense within, feeling a repulsive disgust sense within them every time they're put into an environment where they might normally have had the feeling of rape, something like that. So like any opportunity for rape, they get morally disgusted with that feeling. Something that's placing all moral restrictions onto the rapist in that scenario. And then there's kind of the puritanical conservative or that strategy that's also put into place, where a woman is asking for it whenever she's raped, that the feminists completely absolutely rejects. And so like putting all responsibility upon the woman herself for being in an environment where she had where that opportunity to be raped was there, and they were like willingly risking themselves by putting themselves in that opportunity space. So yeah, there's 2 different, like, I guess, extremes to take the position on. And so like one extreme completely one extreme, the like Clockwork Orange example, completely puts all restrictions onto men, and then the other, like Islamic State example, puts all restrictions upon women, where so yeah, there needs to be like some sort of shared sacrifice between both sexes.